well, I guess I'll introduce this. So this is going to be the outline for our presentation tonight. So problem definition. Throughout this fall semester, our class has been listening to parties involved and with the tragedy at the Philadelphia Energy Solutions site. We've been tirelessly listening and studying many aspects surrounding the site since there were so many aspects involved with the PES site. It was difficult to focus on all the complexities at play. Although we may have touched upon them in conversation, we didn't necessarily focus on aspects such as the fire itself, job loss, and environmental remediation. As a result of listening to the parties involved and studying the complexities at play, we devised a policy analysis. Now some of you may be asking, what is a policy analysis? That is okay, because I still ask this myself, this question every day of this semester. But anyway, a policy analysis is a set of policy options, or rather alternatives, that addresses a problem or some aspect of said problem. To start our policy analysis, we first had to define the problems surrounding this situation. The situation here being the future of the PES refinery site. We identified our audience as the Kennedy administration. However, we recognize actors in the private sector, state, or federal government perhaps have greater influence over the ultimate use of the site. As we heard in the testimony gathered by the refinery board and read its report, we took note of the different interest groups and perspectives that the city officials are tasked with balancing. Understanding the primary responsibility of local government is to its residents, we defined the problem as how the city could influence a use for the PES site that would maximize the well-being of Southwest Philadelphian residents. Our problem definition does deprioritize some concerns, but we thought it was justified since members within the community are most adversely affected. It is our duty as academics, public servants, and Philadelphians to help those and protect those most vulnerable. Because if we, the very people in this room, do not advocate for those individuals, then who will? And with that, I will ask along to pull us.
Greetings, everybody. So after we were able to wrestle the problem definition to the ground, this took some time. We took a lot of time to think about and discuss these things. And we moved on to establishing the goals that we wanted to use to evaluate various policy alternatives that we would develop during the course of the semester. Those four goals were in improving community health outcomes, increasing community political influence over local decisions, ensuring economic wherewithal within the community, and synchronizing with the city's strategic planning. So the first of these goals is in improving community health outcomes. We looked at whether any one of these policy alternatives would help to reduce health impact causing pollution coming from the site, whether it would reduce published rates of disease, if it would improve self-reported perceptions of the health effects of what was coming from the site, would a particular policy alternative result in fewer hospitalizations and lower mortality rates, and would it provide increased green spaces? Our second goal was, does it increase community political influence over local environmental decisions? We had 6 impact categories here. Those were, did the policy alternative improve trust and communication with the city government? Did the community gain seats at the table and decision making? And did the community gain direct control over any of the decision making? We also looked at whether it would increase inter-community equity, create a more open permitting process, and whether it would provide community access to expert help. Our third goal was in ensuring economic vitality and wherewithal. This also had 6 impact categories. And we asked, how does a particular policy alternative reduce the cost of negative externalities, such as healthcare expenses or the loss of income due to illness? Did a particular alternative invest in the community through grants and through improvement of infrastructure? And did it increase access to healthcare? We also wanted to know if it helped to build a vibrant local economy by building in provisions for jobs and seeing how that would impact union density. We asked if it increased community ownership of homes and businesses, and then how did it impact intra-community equity. Our fourth and final goal was synchronizing with the city and its strategic planning. Again, we had 6 impact categories. We asked, does it leverage other public programs? Does a particular policy alternative that we explore fit within existing funding streams within the city or region, even within the state or federal? And do the investments of public money provide high returns in any one or all of the alternatives? We also asked if it helps to meet greenhouse gas goals, such as those set in the Philadelphia 2035 plans. Does it increase green space? And does it create an opportunity for inter-neighborhood equity? And so these are the goals and the impact categories that we used to assess the various policy alternatives that you will be looking at now. Thank you.
Hello, thank you for joining us. So we discussed a lot of alternatives in this class, some of which we liked a lot and were forced to reject because they didn't really fit with our problem definition, which was how do we create a land use that benefits the community. Some of those were like air monitoring around the site or community resource centers in the affected neighborhoods, but they didn't really address the land use. So some that we did and that we considered were a buyout. And with a buyout, you can go in a lot of different directions. But one plausible direction we identified was to pursue a contract with F1, Formula One Racing, and find sponsorship for a race. And then raise funds to finance a buyout of the site and turn it into a racetrack. A pro of that is that the city is in control and it promotes economic development of the area. It would be used throughout the year during races for the season. There could be entertainment complexes along the lines of Xfinity Live. But cons are that it's expensive. We're talking over $1 billion in bonds, and then it's hard to implement on a short time frame. We're up against a time crunch because of the bankruptcy proceedings, and any bond issue would have to go before the voters. We also like the idea of a community impact report in which qualified planners assess development. Here the community is in control and has access to expert help. They can evaluate different economic development proposals, sound off about them in local forums, give feedback to the city, give feedback to private industry. However, absent full veto power, this was somewhat ineffectual. It was limited to sharing an opinion rather than having the ability to stop outright a plan that the community did not like. We also identified tax increment financing as a potential alternative, wherein the city would raise a bond based on future tax revenue increase and use it to lure green development to the PES site. It has a long track record of successful use in commercial development, most notably in the Gallery complex on Market Street. However, it hasn't been used on an industrial site before. There's certain difficulties that you run into when applying this model to an industrial site, among them that you would have to remediate the land to a habitable standard. We talked about the emissions tax a lot in this class. It was a direct tax on hazardous air pollutants, volatile organic compounds, criteria pollutants, and particulate matter. With that tax came community-based budgeting, modeled on various proposals for a carbon tax. This would allow the community to take the funds that were raised based on the tax and determine how those funds would be spent in their communities. It places a cost on pollution, and the community has some control in the allocation of revenue. And it also hopefully lowers some of the health issues in the affected communities. But it's limited in community equity, and it restricts the type of business at the future PES site. Were some drawbacks that we found. The last proposal that we considered was an HF ban, a hydrofluoric acid ban, in which storage of hydrofluoric acid over 1,000 pounds at industrial facilities would be banned. For matter of reference, a gallon of water is about 8 pounds. At 1,000 pounds, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, mandates a risk management plan. So we identified this as a good cutoff point for how much we wanted in our communities. It removes a dangerous chemical from residential neighborhoods and may cause the refinery to shut down. And it decreases health impacts such as respiratory diseases and various forms of illness, and reduces the possibility of a tragic accident. But a con of this is that the refinery could retrofit, although it would be expensive, and it does nothing for air pollution. It doesn't address the HAPs and the VOCs and the criteria pollutants.
Hi there. One of the things we had to consider, of course, is what if we do nothing? What will happen if we take none of these actions? So quickly, I'm going to go over really our assessment of what the future will look like without intervention. And widely, this covers, there's 3 scenarios: a return to the status quo, partial revival, and site abandonment. So a return to the status quo is really, we go back more or less to where we were before. Externalities continue to impact the community around the site. Some level of economic activity continues. This, in some ways, this seems good, but the downside is that the economic conditions for this site as a refinery are worse than they have ever been in the past. There's expected to be a decline in East Coast refining in general, and the PES refinery is not the refinery that you would keep if you were choosing to keep a refinery on the East Coast. It is not particularly economically competitive, and the support package that existed in 2012 was already very generous, and so any benefits the community would experience from the site continuing to function would be even less now. And so even if you think this would be a good scenario, it's unlikely to be as good as it was before. The second scenario that we think is more likely is a partial revival. The site is used for some petrochemical use, but not for refining. This has an immediate reduction in harms, but it also often has reduced economic activity. And one of the big downsides of this is that public action is more difficult because there is some activity happening, but the activity is still somewhat harmful to the community and is still and is not actually that beneficial overall. And because these are very expensive sites that require a large amount of maintenance and investment, this is unstable and will often transition into abandonment, which is where there's no activity going on at the site. And in this case, externalities cease. The communities around the site have some relief, but they also have no income, no benefit, economic benefit from the site. They are not able to, there's no revenue stream that local municipalities can leverage to improve the site or improve outcomes for the community. And also, abandoned sites often become detached from commercial actors, and the city must step in to either contain the site at civic cost or just allow pollution to spread more widely. And all of this leads up to why we must act. The community around the PES site suffers inordinately from disease. Community reports suggest that the asthma rate is 4 times the national average, and that chronic conditions exist at much higher rates than in other areas in Philadelphia or other areas in Pennsylvania. And there is very little evidence that the community around the site experiences any economic benefit from this huge increase in disease. And one of the things we want to urge policymakers to think about is that although these interventions can appear expensive, the cost of not acting is much higher. The impacts on the health of the community and on the overall economic health of the city of allowing the site to operate are extremely high. And the fact that we don't pay money to do directly into the financing of the site should not allow us to believe that we are not paying a cost. And though it's not exactly aligned with our goals, it's worth saying that this is an opportunity for Philadelphia to set a new direction and a new standard for how to move into a post-climate future. Philadelphia ostensibly presents itself as being very pro-green, trying to create a forward-looking climate change policy. And this presents an opportunity where Philadelphia can set a standard for how to transition from an industrial past into a green future that acknowledges climate change and acknowledges the communities that have been victimized by our previous policies around industrial sites and pollution. And with that, some of my colleagues will present our thoughts on HF and emission tax.
Okay, so first I'm going to talk a little bit about the hydrofluoric acid ban. As Benjamin said earlier, essentially what this is looking at is the fact that currently the site uses hydrofluoric acid in the process of production. If you're not familiar, hydrofluoric acid, or HF, is very dangerous, very volatile substance. If there was a release which there was during the explosion, I'll talk about that in a second, it could be cause very serious health effects or even death in a pretty quick amount of time. It also produces a vapor cloud that sort of hugs the ground and disperses widely. So the potential for a pretty catastrophic outcome is definitely there. When the explosion happened in June, there actually was more than 5,000 pounds released at that time. Luckily, the fire burned it off, and so it was not able to get into contact with people in the surrounding area. So there were at least 5,000 pounds that were released then. Additionally, since the refinery has ceased operation, an additional 340,000 pounds were neutralized after the closure, and that is way over the 1,000 pounds we are looking at setting as the threshold for a ban, or I guess a restriction on hydrofluoric acid. So this policy basically requires the City Council to pass legislation that would restrict storage of HF over 1,000 pounds. And so while this does not outlaw refining on the site or anywhere within the City of Philadelphia, we considered this when we analyzed the policy as an effectual ban on refining, just because of the costs associated with retrofitting the refinery to do something other than use something other than hydrofluoric acid. Probably sulfuric acid would be what it would be used to, or what it would be changed to use, which has its own risks as well. But in terms of the conversion from using hydrofluoric acid, looking at similar projects from Valero and Delek, we're looking at a cost of about $340 to $466 million just to change it from hydrofluoric acid to sulfuric acid. We also are talking about the cost of deferred maintenance. This is not the first bankruptcy that PES has gone through. They also went through one in 2018, and they did manage to restructure, but it has not been very economically viable for some time, and they've deferred at least $130 million of maintenance, as well as then the cost of purchasing the site, and then the fact that the site is sort of outdated. It only uses light sweet crude, which is declining in existence and is more expensive, and not a very competitive refinery in terms of infrastructure.
So the other aspect of this combined policy action is the emissions tax. This policy also requires City Council to pass legislation which would levy a tax on the pollutants that we've discussed previously. Interestingly, in 2017, 790,000 pounds of air emissions were released, and 57% of that was released by the PEF site. So at $42 per pound, which is the estimated cost of, social cost of carbon at this time based on an EPA analysis, even though this is not a carbon tax, just for simplicity purposes, that's the rate that we used. Based on the amount of air emissions, we could bring in approximately 33 million annually if they stayed at the same level. And this would require participatory budgeting with the community involved to determine where the revenue goes and what it pays for within the community. And something that's important to note with this tax is that economics kind of insinuates that taxing the specific activity that leads to negative externalities can incentivize firms to cut back on that behavior. So in this case, if air emissions do continue, it would decrease across the city. However, if the tax is high enough, it could discourage fossil fuel industry, which, however, there would still potentially be other polluting activities on the site. So in that case, air emissions would still decrease because the site would be closed, but in this case, there would still be some taxes in that. So this analysis is really around how they work together. So as we discussed, the HF ban is highly likely to ensure that fossil fuel use, or at least a refinery operation, would not be financially feasible. But other heavy industrial use may still emit pollution, and it does not provide the community with political agency. So when we combine this with the emissions tax, any future emissions are still being taxed. The other existing industrial sites would be taxed across the city, therefore we would still have some revenue and potentially decreased pollution. The local community benefits directly and provides them with a seat at the table.
Okay, so we analyzed our policy, our combined policies against the 4 goals that Beth talked about at the beginning. So looking at community health outcomes, essentially in terms of health, we classified this policy combination as successful. Directly restricting HF removes a potentially catastrophic, the possibility of a potentially catastrophic event from a release at the refinery. Indirectly restricting HF means that fewer hazardous air pollutants or HAPs, including benzene, will be released, again on the assumption that this site will not be used for refining, and anything that will be there would be less polluting than a refinery. The HAPs, these hazardous air pollutants, have been linked to respiratory issues, cancers, and other illnesses that are present in higher than the average proportions in Southwest Philadelphia. Also, research has shown that decrease in emissions, which would be brought on by both the closure of the site and then an emissions tax, that would mean that there would be less published rates of disease and fewer hospitalizations due to those diseases. And additionally, we had mentioned that self-reported health, including mental health, was one of the areas we wanted to look at when thinking about community health outcomes. And the refinery, residents of the community have very negative feelings about the refinery, as anyone would who lived near a refinery. So the closure of the refinery would hopefully create some positive self-reported health effects as well. In terms of community political influence, In terms of the HF ban, this shows that the city is taking safety concerns seriously. Especially after the release and the explosion in June, people were very concerned about something that a lot of people didn't even realize was on the site and had this catastrophic potential. So the city taking action and saying we aren't going to allow that to happen shows that they are taking concerns seriously, they take the safety of citizens seriously, and could improve some trust between the city government and communities in the area. Additionally, the participatory budgeting process, wherein the community would get to decide where some portion of the revenue from the emissions tax is used towards, would give community members decision-making power and an official seat at the table, not just sort of a honorary or voluntary one, that the city would have to include community members no matter what. Additionally, it contributes to intra-community equity, again, by allowing all community members to help decide where tax revenue goes.
Okay, and then the other two that we analyzed is increasing economic benefit. In this case, it's highly likely to have a positive effect, however, it's hard to project the extent. We do know that the reduced cost of negative externalities associated with decreasing pollution has the potential, some studies have shown, to increase home values. There are improved health results, which can decrease your healthcare costs. We do know that asthma alone is estimated to cost over $3,000 annually, and that's probably a low estimate. We do know that if there was an increase in home values, there are other sets of problems that are associated with that, like people being priced out of their neighborhoods or increased property taxes, which would be considered. But the tax revenue from the emissions taxes funnel directly into the community, and that increases investment directly. And it does not necessarily increase community ownership of homes and businesses, but it is possible that the community would decide to leverage something along those lines. And then synchronizing with city goals, again, by continuing to have the site closed, which was the largest source of pollution in the city, it decreases greenhouse gas emissions as well as the other hazardous air pollution. It leverages existing city tax structures, creates a new funding stream, and already utilizes the legislative responsibilities of the city council. Let's see. There's minimal cost of implementation, and if any costs that are there would be covered through the tax revenue. And because taxes for emissions are across the city, it would also benefit other communities that have pollution causing industry in their location.
So our next policy alternative is tax increment financing plus community impact report. I'll first start off by talking about tax increment financing, and then we'll move on to community impact report. Note that we are only proposing that the city offer this incentive to businesses that will use the site for a greener land use. So tax increment financing, also known as TIF, is a financing tool used by local governments to provide funding for redevelopment projects using future tax revenues. So the first step is to establish a TIF district, which will include the area that the site is in, and then typically also includes some surrounding area. After the TIF district is identified, the base amount of taxes or the current amount of tax revenues being collected in that area is established as the base and is frozen for the life of the project. So to give an example, if I own a house in the TIF district, and the year that the TIF district is established, I'm paying $100 in property taxes that year. The next year, if my property taxes go up to $120, that $20 increase is the tax increment. That's the portion that would go toward funding the project. That base amount of $100 would stay with the city and the school district. In Philadelphia, taxes that can be included in the TIF district are property tax, use and occupancy tax, business income and receipts tax, and sales tax. The maximum life of a TIF district in the city is 20 years, so there wouldn't be longer than a 20-year period where tax increments are going to fund the project. And financing through TIF can be used for a variety of eligible uses, most notably new construction and site improvements. In our proposal for this alternative, we're proposing that the TIF district include the PES refinery site and also extend southward to include the Navy Yard. Because TIF districts aren't limited to including the area that they're providing financing for, you can extend the district to capture more tax dollars, resulting in higher revenues that can fund the redevelopment. So the Navy Yard was chosen because the area of the TIF district must be contiguous. It can't be various spots throughout the city. It has to be one continuous area. And there's also further plans to redevelop the Navy Yard, which means the tax dollars generated by the Navy Yard will increase. So including the Navy Yard in this provides a much larger financing tool, or much larger pool of funding for the redevelopment of the PES site. TIF projects are politically feasible in Philadelphia. There have been over 30 TIF districts approved in the city since the program's been around in the mid-90s. It was actually the primary incentive that the city used to try to attract Amazon to the city, so obviously the city must feel like it's a good incentive. And in that proposal, the city was able to get preliminary approval from city council and the school district, saying that they were supportive of this. So we would hope that the city again would be able to work with the city council and school district to get their preliminary approval to offer this incentive to greener businesses. So overall, TIF is a self-sustaining financing mechanism that can be used for development that may not otherwise take place. It sparks growth and benefits the local economy. And after the district has expired, tax revenues are increased, which means the city's making more money from those revenues. The TIF itself supports the goal of ensuring economic vitality in the community because it's increasing revenues, it's increasing investment. It would hopefully attract businesses, which would attract jobs. At this point, we wouldn't know the full economic impact, however, because we don't know what businesses might be attracted. So we can't estimate things like jobs created and what types of jobs those would be, a number of businesses. But throughout the approval process, businesses that would be interested in this would have to come up with a proposal that would include all of those numbers. This also synchronizes with the city plans because TIF is shown to have a good return on investment in the city. It's a current city program that's been offered again since the mid-90s. And this alternative, if successful, would also support the greenhouse gas goals, the reduction of greenhouse gases by attracting greener businesses because the refinery itself wouldn't be operating anymore.
So once a TIF district is established and the idea and the funding for a TIF district is established, that's going to be supplemented with a community impact report. So what the community impact report is, and the way I like to think of it, is a proposal for a proposal. So it's a report that's designed to assess all the positive and negative impacts that the project or the developer will have on the community, which goes along with part of our overarching goal, which is preserving community well-being. So this report will be carried out by a third-party qualified planner, which would be retained by the city itself. The qualified planner would have 6 months to create the report and present it to the community, and the community would then have a 3-month period filled with bi-weekly meetings with all the stakeholders involved, so the private industry, the city council, and the community members, and any others, to discuss concerns with the proposal. And the community would have final approval on the project itself. So the report actually will include data on projected health outcomes related to the land usage. So this will mitigate the problem of not being able to directly relate health outcomes to the site, to the industrial land usage. So this will establish hopefully some causality, including the projected rates of disease like asthma and other cancers linked to the industrial site. It will also include data on community economic impacts, so how much of the site of the land usage will, investment into that will go back into the community surrounding the area, not the community necessarily peripheral to the area, and what effect it would have on local businesses. So it's sort of an overarching assessment of all the proposals that would come through.
Hello, I am presenting the part of the buyout, which is my personal recommendation for the future land use of the site. This kind of has 5 overarching points that it needs to hit in order to really be accomplished. We started with this bond the city's going to need to have passed, and it'll be a municipal revenue bond. It'll be for no more than $1.5 billion, and it will cover all the costs that the project will need. And this will first go to purchasing and the transition of the site. So the purchasing is expected to be at current taxable land value, about $50 million. And that's just the points on the map over here, just Girard Point and Point Breeze. And then this dismantling will need to happen, which could potentially be up to another $10 to $20 million. But then we have the remediation, and Sunoco and PES currently are supposed to be taking on a good portion of this responsibility, but there is a budget in this bond for $400 million that can go to helping the remediation of the site. After the remediation, the city will begin to design and build some green spaces. And those would be 2 main spaces. The first space would be a public park, which would be on Passayunk and South 26. And the other one would be just on South 26, and it'll go for about a mile between Passayunk and the streets just south of that. But it'll be about 150-foot wide section of trees to help reduce not only pollution that the site may produce, but also noise from the site for the surrounding communities. After that, the site will need to be developed. So this is going to be 3 main parts of this development. First will be the racetrack, which is a very fascinating part of it, due to the fact that we're going to need to get FIA, the an international F1 company, that we're going to need to have them agree to be racing at Philadelphia for an extended period of time in order for this site to be profitable. There is good reason that F1 would want to come here due to the fact of its location. I mean, it's in the Northeast Corridor, it's in Philadelphia, which is a very densely populated city. It's a racetrack that's going to be in the city limits. This doesn't happen very often in the United States, especially for the history of F1 in the United States. So there's good reason that F1 would find this interesting. On top of this, there'll be a music amphitheater, which can be part of the racetrack seating and will allow for music concerts anytime you need. And then there's going to be parking and there's going to be transit. So parking is going to be a small section because we want to push people who visit the site to use public transit as much as possible. So the blue lines on the map, that's going to be where a lot of transit changes are going to happen. There's also going to be connections to 30th Street Station using rail lines and buses that will then be help the community because there will be more public transit that the community can help use. The last point is a very important point of this. Since the site will have to have concessions, it is an entertainment complex. These concessions, instead of being just owned by the city of Philadelphia, the city of Philadelphia is going to reach out and is going to try and have as many businesses from Southwest Philadelphia come and try and have them be the concessions so that those businesses can make money from the site on their own. After as many businesses as possible have joined, then it'll be open to Philadelphia and then whomever. So the goals we kind of talked about, I'm going to start with how this doesn't do so well. So it doesn't do a great job with community political influence. It does do something though. It not only creates an advisory meeting that happens twice a year, but it will also have a quarterly press release newspaper that will inform the community on the state of the remediation and the project as a whole. And in terms of synchronizing with the city's goals, although it doesn't hit very many points, it hits one, I believe, important point, which is that it will increase revenue for the city in a way that the city can use. In terms of what it does do well, it's pretty good for the community's economic outcome. If we look at how it invests in the neighborhood, not only is those transit investments, but there's those green space investments too. The map on the right is current median household income, and you can see it's pretty low. So another way we can increase that median household income is through improving economic success. And that's going to be two major ways. The first way is, again, that transit. Providing transit is a wonderful way to help a community's economic outcomes. The second way is those concessions that I talked about earlier. Providing more revenue for those residents is a wonderful way to help their economic success. Finally, we have the community health outcomes. This map is an asthma map for asthma rates in the area. So you can see that region doesn't have good asthma rates. So in terms of reducing disease, pretty much any way that the refinery is not operating is going to be beneficial. But it's important to note that if we can avoid abandonment, that's going to be really beneficial, because abandonment can have negative mental health outcomes for the communities that they're around. It also shows that crime rates tend to be twice as high near abandoned sites. So we want to avoid that if possible, which would be pretty good for mental health. And then there's those green spaces I talked about earlier, which would be pretty good for mental health. So again, I recommend this alternative due to its ability to increase revenue for the city. It's going to prevent abandonment, and it's going to improve the overall health outcomes for the city as a whole.
So one of the really fun things about talking about contemporary issues in the classroom is that we don't have to get too realistic too fast. And we don't have to satisfy everybody. And you see that here. We have, as a class, we took on this issue. We knew it was an issue the city was talking about. We knew it was an issue that the city was talking with everybody about. And we also saw that the city was constrained in a lot of ways. And we said, well, we don't need to be constrained in those ways. We can think about policy alternatives very broadly. We can think about things that maybe aren't even apparently feasible. And we can take a point of view. We can say, the thing that we care about is not whether the fossil fuel companies are going to be happy with this. We can take the point of view of saying, does it make life better for people in Philadelphia? And so in the process, it was possible that we would come up with completely unrealistic policy alternatives. And I think that this has been really a wonderful and interesting process in that we have come up with possibilities for policy that aren't crazy. They might not be what the city wants to do, like, first and foremost. But things like imposing taxes or bans on certain kinds of emissions, that's a doable thing, right? Things like the tax increment financing is something that the city has already done, and the community having a more meaningful process of community involvement and study in order to grant a tax increment financing changes the game, I think, in a way that, again, realistic and certainly possible, let's say that. The last of the options that you heard about is ambitious, right? And it would take a lot of political will and a lot of political capital, but it also, the work that we've done here shows that, you know, you could do it. It's possible that the city could take over. Whether, again, it's feasible or
desirable is a different thing. But I think that what we've accomplished is to create some space for thinking further. Now, we've accomplished this in 10 weeks. The students who you just heard from walked in here at the end of September knowing nothing but maybe what they heard in the news about the PES refinery and the situation. Like, oh yeah, that wasn't there an accident back there, right? And now they've become experts. But we've only had 10 weeks, and so 2 weeks ago, when we were talking about this, we agreed that we would still, like, if we had 6 more weeks, we'd have a lot more to say, and we might adjust these options further. And we might study them further to see what they'd actually do. Because we're making a lot of claims about what they probably do, how they probably work. And to some extent, that's the nature of policy analysis, because you can't know till you've done it. But to some extent, that's the nature of a condensed time period that we haven't turned over every rock to find out exactly what the evidence would show us. But I hope that we have, through what we've done, put some extra possibilities on the table that might be debated, discussed, pulled into the conversation. So I want to thank everyone in the class for the incredible work that they've done over the last 10 weeks, because this really has been a steep learning curve, because it's not like they came in knowing how to do policy analysis either. They learned it all at once. And I'd like to thank you all for coming and for your interest and attention in what they came up with. So I very much appreciate everyone's efforts. Thank you. And I should say, we had a series of speakers this quarter to tell us about the situation, help us learn about the situation, and we'd like to thank all of them, as well as the Center for Public Policy, who helped us pull this together tonight. So, thank you very much, and we would love to take your questions about any of what we've talked about tonight, or the process by which we've got here, or anything like that. Fiona?
So talking about the tax increment financing, have there been instances where there's been pushback from the public when they've been put into a TIF zone, or is it usually something that both the city and residents are sort of on board with?
Okay. So in Philadelphia, it has to be approved by city council, so there is somewhat of a transparent process. However, to what extent the community is typically involved in that, I don't know. There are areas though, like Chicago, where the community is strongly against it, but that's because Chicago has over 140 TIF districts. They use it a lot. It's not used too often in Philadelphia. I think there's only been one such project since 2011.
So there are a lot of refineries in this country, and there are a lot of refineries on the East Coast. In your research, have you found any areas where those refineries have closed and that city, state, wherever it is, rehabbed that space into something that wasn't a refinery? Are there any instances of that?
I don't know if this was by the city, but Chargers Stadium in Los Angeles was a highly polluted site. I don't know if it was a refinery, it was a highly polluted site, and it was remediated to a successful level, and now there's Chargers Stadium there. So,
in general, no.
I would care about that if they were a good team.
In general, no. Looking into historic examples of refineries going bankrupt and ceasing operations in one way or another, the sites are generally not remediated to a non-industrial use afterward. But there are industrial sites that have been remediated with kind of similar levels of pollution. I found the EPA Superfund site has a list of kind of like case studies where they talk about processes of remediation of extremely polluted sites. I didn't find any refineries specifically. The one I'm thinking about is there was a coal ash dump, which has some similarities, that was remediated and is now a public park. So these things are possible, but then again, Superfund sites use federal funds. It's unusual for a city by itself to completely transform a site.
I would presume that with refineries, and I'm sure that Gwen can confirm this, there are a lot of things that run underground there. And I wonder if all of the piping matrix for those units is why we're not seeing that as often, because it's very difficult to remediate pipes that were put in the ground in the 40s and 50s when they built these places.
My first hunch, in fact, would be that refineries don't close very often.
Well, no.
They don't stop being refineries very often because there's so much of a capital investment in that facility that the incentive is to invest and invest and invest and keep that thing limping along until you can't get anything out of it anymore. I mean, I can think of 2 refineries in the country that have closed kind of ever, and I'm sure my knowledge is not comprehensive, but I don't think it happens very often. So I think our absence of understanding comes from the fact that it's just so unusual. I would say that it's one of the reasons that what we do here in Philadelphia is so important. Because refineries have to close. That we cannot keep doing fossil fuels indefinitely. So we have the opportunity to set a precedent for how a site can move away from fossil fuels. And I think it matters very much what we decide to do in Philadelphia, just again, because it is so rare.
And to go a little, there's a site in St. Croix in the U.S. Virgin Islands that has been shut down for some time, though there's talks about reopening it. And there's a site in Chicago that's been remediated for some time, and I don't actually know what its current state is, but they both involved an enormous amount of oil underground that was trapped, and then there's various efforts to keep that oil trapped where it is, and relatively expensive efforts to remove it. And so there is some, but it's very rare. Could only find a few examples of refineries shutting down ever and mostly in U.S. territories, not in the continental U.S. so much, which is, maybe some lessons on why continental U.S. Doesn't like having refineries in it, and we farm that out to more vulnerable communities.
And as in the PES case, sometimes they shut down and they don't become something else right away. They kind of hang around until they become refineries again.
Like Eagle Point across the river, PES's sister refinery, just hanging out there.
So if I can just add to that, there's ConocoPhillips down in Trainer, and I believe a Marcus Hook facility have gone from refinery to a storage and distribution transfer. So they don't get remediated, but they're not refining. So there's a drop in emissions there, which is somewhat positive. It's not a total cleanup. And about remediation, even with this refinery, you can't assess underneath the facility structures because of the integrity issues. So they have not fully assessed the contamination, but we do know that there's millions of gallons of light aqueous phase liquids that are in the aquifer underneath the whole South Philadelphia community, probably extending into New Jersey, that have yet to be remediated. So there's huge costs, and you're not talking 30 years, 40 years until these things are remediated at that facility. It's going to take a long time.
Do you know if the remediation process will create emissions comparable to what operating
Not in the
creates?
air,
So-
but absolutely in the soil and the water.
So first off, it's not a superfund because it's oil. So it would fall under the Oil Pollution Act issues, which unless there's a release to the environment that is of concern under the Coast Guard's authorities, they wouldn't even fund it through that. So it is responsible party cleanup. So they have to be a viable, responsible party to do the cleanup. So Superfund can't really get involved necessarily with that. And this is the problem we had to do with this whole response that Superfund for EPA was struggling to get in there. So finding the monies, if there is abandonment, if they walk off, it's going to be a struggle to find the money to actually remediate the facility.
Any other questions or comments?
I know Texas blew up, or it had a bad fire, and my son went and viewed it. It was horrifying looking, and I'm wondering if they're going to rebuild, because it was horrible.
Where is that?
In Texas.
Just a few days ago, right?
No,
No,
this was months ago.
Okay.
And then it burnt up the whole big, Texas was big.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I don't know. I haven't heard.
Can I ask about the TIFs? Is that an increasing tax on residential property owners too?
It doesn't increase taxes. It uses any increases that occur because of citywide increased tax rates or tax increases because of assessed value increases.
Okay.
I just want to make some comments about the overall report. I just want to say to everybody that was involved in it, I think you did a really good job in looking at the different aspects of this whole business. Just a few things I want to say is that the oil refinery, the present oil refinery that was there, the fact that they had the fire was not, this oil refinery was losing money for many years. And they knew they wanted to get rid of it, okay? It was just about finding the right buyer, the right business that was willing to take over this white elephant that wasn't really working. And the reason why it wasn't working is because crude, the fuel that they needed, the crude fuel, they had to import from the West Coast that was costing them a tremendous amount of money. And so they were losing money, plus they had to follow the laws that are already in place as far as having a certain portion of their business being a something that wasn't going to cause problems in the community, not use hydrofluoric fuel. So they had to apply with those regulations too. So, I think at the point that we're at now in this whole battle is that, and it is a battle, okay, that is just trying to make sure that whatever comes in its place will do the things that are best for the citizens of Philadelphia. And it really is about more than just South and Southwest Philadelphia, because someone mentioned about how they contain the hydrofluoric fuel, hydrofluoric. It was in the air, people. If it burned, what happens? Smoke goes in the air. That air travels. There was a man that came to our meeting from New Jersey, and he brought up a very important point people aren't really looking at. It's the effect that it's having. That oil refinery is on water. So whatever has the pollutants that went down into the ground, they go down into the water. And it's a known fact that the water sea level is rising, and probably the area around the oil refinery in years to come will be underwater.
It will be.
What happens to that pollutant? So they're concerned in New Jersey now, like they're saying, oh my God, maybe we need to start thinking, the cities that are on the New Jersey side, we need to be thinking about, maybe we need to be doing something on that end about the water. So, the issue goes on, and I think the fact that when I thought about policy analysis, I thought about the fact that you get the opportunity to dream, and you get the opportunity to think out of the box, and to present those views to people who you can't think that they care or they know. And I think that it is what you all are becoming are the ones that are going to say, you know what, maybe you need to think about this. So I applaud you, everybody that was involved, and I think that in your own separate areas, you did a good job.
Thank you. I wanted to say something. I salute each and every one of you. That your reports are fantastic. I really enjoyed this. And I wanted to say, I live next to the silent killer. It is a silent killer, and it's killing Philadelphians. My two daughters suffered from it severely. And one is in New Jersey. They both had cancer at the same time, two different cancers. Now one has blood cancer. But no one recognized that it's been a silent killer for years. I moved to South Philadelphia in the 60s, and I watched it blow up several times, over and over, people running out of their home. It's a killer, and people want to live in that area, but that refinery's been there 150 years. It's time for it to go. And I'm excited and happy to come here and hear this, that you will take interest in this. This is important because it affects all Philadelphians, all of us. And the men that work at the refinery, I feel horrible for them because one said, what are you talking about? I had cancer. My mother and father had cancer. They're dead. But I want my job. I've been there 25, 30 years, but I need my job. We're all going to die from something. That hurt so bad. I mean, he was in the union. I jumped up. I got the TV cameras everywhere. Because who wants to work around there? Who would want a job? I mean, you have to be distorted to want to work under the, and find out what it does to you. I mean, we smell the air every day for years. And whoever thought that we would have an epidemic in South and Southwest Philadelphia. When I say an epidemic, believe me, it's bad. It's badder than what you want to believe it is. It's horrible. You hear me? And it's killing people, and babies are born. One girl just had a baby about 3 months ago, born with brain damage from it. And our city council says, can you prove it? My sister had cancer, he said, but can you prove that it's coming to refinery? God gave us clean air. Clean air and clean water. Now we hear that our water is affected. We're drinking polluted water. Come on. And I'm so happy about your reports. They're excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you, by the way. I've been to the meetings, and I think that your efforts will make a difference.
Thank you.
Keep raising your voices.
And we have a meeting with the mayor. Let's see what he says. And we want to go to Harrisburg.
I think Philly Thrive was an essential data source for us, for being able to give us information from the community and a voice that is outside of the structures of power that have created this,
And I'm glad
this
you
situation.
latched on. Oh my God, people are caring more and more.
I just wanted to say to our guests, all of our guests, but in particular our guests that came from Philly Thrive and from the neighborhood, I so appreciate your generosity of time and energy and sharing your stories, both coming into the classroom and helping to educate us, because you don't have to do that, and you did. Thank you. And for coming back today and hearing what we worked. We really hope to bring something to the table, not just for y'all, but for everybody who has as a stakeholder in this decision making. So just thank you for making that extra effort.
Everyone cares. I'm so happy to see that more people care about breathing fresh, clean air. This is important because it was given to us free, and we should be excited for them to leave.
All right, anybody want the last word? All right, well then, thank you all for all your work and for being here, and please stay and mingle.